Hello and welcome to our last video on the Eucharistic revival and what we believe about the Eucharist. This one in particular will be on Eucharistic miracles, and I want to talk about one in particular, but there's actually a really good book out there entitled Eucharistic Miracles. Really clever, creative title about Eucharistic miracles. Anyway, if you are curious about it, go ahead and buy a copy. I'll buy you a copy. I might regret that. No, I'd buy you a copy. That would be great. If everybody read it, that would be wonderful. Anyway, really good book. Eucharistic miracles are basically, we talked last time about metaphysics, about how the Eucharist undergoes substantial change, but the accidents remain the same. But there are some cases in miracles where the accidents actually changed. The bread actually looked like a piece of flesh, or the blood looked like blood, human blood. And not only that, but they've done some testing on these that show that as well. So let me share a couple brief stories. So one of my favorite Eucharistic miracle stories happened in Spain. It was a rancher who, there was a host that a young kid had that brought home from church, and they didn't really realize what they were doing. But they had buried it in the ranch, kind of near the gate where some horses would go. And the rancher at the time didn't know it. The kid just sort of brought it back or whatever, and like sort of forgot that he had it from Mass, and so put the Eucharist in the dirt, kind of in the spot or whatever. And then the rancher, whenever he would take his horses by this spot, by this gate, he'd open the gate to put them out to the pasture. Every time the horses would go over there, the two front legs of the horse, they would sort of buckle. You know how like horses can kind of like kneel down a little bit, and the horses would go down just on that joint in their leg before going through the door. And the rancher thought this was really weird, and it took a year before the kid finally had said, and sort of confessed to saying, I accidentally brought a host home from Mass, and I buried it there, and they actually dug it up, and there was the host. I actually can't remember if it looked like flesh or not, but there was a year that rancher kept bringing the horses by there, and they were all essentially genuflecting in front of the Eucharist. They had a sense that the Eucharist was there. So that's one of my favorite Eucharistic miracle stories. Another one happened in Orvieto, Italy. So there's the corporal is the white cloth that's on the altar. And there was a priest that was celebrating Mass, and the priest had admitted that he himself was having a lot of doubts about whether or not it truly was Jesus' body and blood. But as he was celebrating Mass, on the white cloth that was there, the corporal, spots of red began to show up on there, and the host itself started to emit human blood. They did some testing on that corporal, and it did show that it was in fact human blood. So you can go today to Orvieto, Italy. It has a really cool cathedral, a lot of good artwork, some frescoes by Giotto, one of the great Italian fresco artists. But one of the cooler things is that it has this reliquary that has the corporal, the white cloth, and you can see the actual blood stains that are on there. There's another one in Lanciano where the host itself became actually a piece of human flesh, and that's also in a reliquary. You can go see that piece of flesh that used to be a host. The one that I want to talk about today comes from Buenos Aires, and it happened just back in 1996, so it's not even that old. So in 1996, there was a priest that was celebrating Mass, and somewhere they had found a host in the church. It was sort of discarded or just placed somewhere in the church. So somebody in the church had found it and brought it up to the priest, and the priest said, okay, we'll put it in a glass of water so that it'll dissolve, and we'll put it in the tabernacle. So they put it in the tabernacle for the host to dissolve. When they came back to it later, they looked in the cup of water, and it appeared to change into a piece of flesh and human blood. And so they didn't know exactly what to do about that, but they contacted the local bishop, and the local bishop, his name was Jorge Bergoglio, who's now Pope Francis actually, told them to keep it in there and to keep it in secrecy, but to keep it in there thinking that it'll probably dissolve. It might just be natural means. It might just be red mold that sometimes shows up on different things, and but the host itself would dissolve. Well, they left it in there for 3 years, and it didn't change. It remained to look like a piece of flesh and look like there was red spots of blood in there as well. So the bishop, Jorge Bergoglio, now Pope Francis, had it sent off for scientific studies. And I want to grab, just to make sure I get all the details of the scientific studies, which is pretty amazing. They sent it off to Dr. Frederick at Columbia University in New York. And they had Dr. Frederick do some studies on it. They did not tell them what the substance was. They didn't tell him it was a host. They just wanted him to do some studies to say what this was. As he started to do studies, he took a bit of the tissue itself, and did some examinations, and he was able to find very specifically what this was. And he said it's a piece of human flesh, or it's a piece of the human body, and he was able to pinpoint that it was actually a part of the left ventricle of the heart muscle. So he could specifically go down to this was a part of the heart. Some of the studies also said it was in an inflammatory condition, an inflamed heart, which means it was under a lot of stress or agony, which is fitting, of course, with what we know about Jesus, his sacrifice on the cross, and what we believe about the Eucharist being a sacrifice offered on the altar. So he said it was under an inflammatory condition. Here's one of the craziest things. He had said that when he did the studies of it, he found a large number of white blood cells, which means at the time he did the testing, it would have been a living person, because white blood cells disintegrate within like an hour or two after a body ceases to live. Now here's the thing, they did testing 3 years after this host had been found and placed in the tabernacle. And so when he did the testing, he said, so at the time of testing, he said it must have been a living being, because there's white blood cells there, and white blood cells don't exist outside of living beings. They disintegrate quite quickly. And it was an inflammatory condition. He also said when he was making this report, he said the owner of it, whoever had that heart, had been beaten severely in the chest. And it was at that point that the doctor actually informed them to say, you should contact the police and authorities because there had been some violent crime that was committed. And he was serious about this. He had no idea it came from a host or anything like that. He said, this person was severely beaten. It was an inflamed condition. There was a lot of stress, a lot of these sorts of things. So you should inform the police about this. The doctor himself was a forensic scientist, a cardiologist and a forensic scientist. So he said, you should contact the police because whoever this belonged to was beaten severely. And to such a state, you should contact the police. This was a crime. Anyway, not knowing that this was a host. Okay, as he was doing the studies, there were actually 2 Australian journalists who actually watched him do the studies and sort of were following this whole thing. And so these Australian journalists took note of everything that was going on. After he did all of the testing and had informed him about all these things, they then let the scientists know, the cardiologist and forensic scientists know, this actually came from a host that was found in a church that had been in the tabernacle for 3 years. And the doctor, the scientist that had done all the studies, had no explanation for it. He just had no scientific explanation. He even said, like when he was doing the white blood cells, he said, "This is weird. This is not normal. That you wouldn't find this unless you had just taken this from the person's body who had just died." So he had no explanation for why this could be, or how this could happen when they told him it came actually from the host.